Okay. Good evening and welcome to the first Zoom talk of the BTA's series of talks, however long it goes on for. COVID dependent, I guess. Can I also thank Barry Stagg, the chairman, for inviting me to start the series. As you can see, my collection is on copper. In fact, it's on all aspects of copper and its main alloys, which we know as brasses and bronzes. And it has three parts. The first is a section called From the Big Bang to the Neolithic. It's a rather grand title. Covers the cosmological origins of copper right through to the first mines, about first mining of copper ores about 10,000 years ago. So that's basically geology to you and me. And I'm going to illustrate this with some recent research I've done on copper minerals on stamps, that is. Then there's a section on the very many physical properties of copper and its alloys, and the fact that there are even more uses of them. And I'm just going to select one of those. That's electrical conductivity. And I'm going to look at the adoption of copper lightning rods or lightning conductors. And then I'm going to finish with illustrating something from the third part of my collection, which is on the social and economic history of copper mining, smelting, and trade around the world. And I'm going to focus on one aspect in particular and one mine in particular. That's Nuku'alofa in the outback of South Australia. Before COVID, I used to go to stamp fairs. Dealers would ask me, what do you collect? And I'd say copper. And then they'd try and offload their stocks of rock and mineral stamps that they couldn't sell to anybody else. So I more or less ignored these dealers, and I more or less ignored these stamps as well until lockdown, when I decided I really needed to develop that first geological section of my collection. And that got me to researching copper minerals on stamps. And this is what I found. But before I go into those results, I'd like to tell you that developing a list of stamps for a non-orthodox topic or theme is time consuming. I had to go to many sources and cross-reference those sources because none of them are complete. That includes geological stamp websites, which are often not updated. The most recent stamp catalogues don't always have the latest stamps. I noticed in a recent issue of Gibbon Stamp Monthly that they were, for one country, they were adding stamps from 2016. Not copper mineral stamps. Dealers lists are just that. They're a list of what they have to sell, and the online catalogues do vary in accuracy. But I suspect as thematic collectors, you know some of that anyway. Well, I found there were 160 stamps illustrating copper minerals, and I'm not including postal stationery or postmarks or anything else at the present time. They illustrated 31 different copper minerals. Now, let's put that in perspective. There are 156 copper minerals known. 20% of those have appeared on stamps. So plenty of opportunities there for postal administrations around the world. Copper minerals are actually quite rare if you think that there are only 156 and there are 5,600 known minerals. Anyway, back to the copper minerals. I grouped them into 5-year periods from 1960 to the present day, as this graph in the top right shows. The first copper mineral stamp issued was in 1960. It's the little 30-cent Pro Patria stamp on the left at the bottom. It's showing a so-called azurite sun. Azurite's a form of copper carbonate. Issues have been modest in most decades. Often less than 5 stamps, usually less than 10 stamps. But that was until the 2010s, when a few postal administrations went berserk, and we have these big spikes of 30+ stamps issued in each 5-year period. There was also a minor spike in the late 1990s. So one of the first stamps in my old geological collection from my teenage years was this rather fetching Russian stamp in the middle at the bottom. It's of malachite. It's from the Soviet Union's Minerals of the Ural Mountains set. And malachite's another copper mineral. So there we have two copper carbonates, azurite and malachite. Surprisingly, perhaps, given I've owned this stamp for, let's say, 50 years or so, it's still in my collection. It's also one of the very few stamps with a black background, possibly a rather fetching Soviet design feature. Of course, the penny black is better known in that respect. Anyway, malachite and azurite account for 48% of all copper mineral stamps that have been issued. But more importantly, in the broader thematic context, they were often the first copper ores that were discovered and from which early mines were developed. That's because they're usually found at the surface, or if not in the surface, in the upper few centimeters of the topsoil, and they indicate there is more copper at depth. And the reason they're easily spotted, as you can see, is they're very colorful. So the question is, do I collect all 160 copper mineral stamps, or if not, which ones should I collect? What I might exhibit, of course, is another matter entirely. For example, should I collect this Somali stamp at the bottom right? It illustrates the most economically important copper ore, that's chalcopyrite, but it has more information than just the mineral illustration. It shows the atomic structure on the left, albeit I think this is actually copper and not chalcopyrite. But Stanley Gibbons relegates this stamp to an appendix. Okay, the 6 stamps on this slide shows, it's a little mistake here. Okay, apologies. The British Geological Survey lists 11 economically important copper ores. They're in this table, along with the number of stamps of each of those ores which has been issued. There are 111 stamps in total. Only one, a copper sulfite called antlerite, which I'm going to illustrate now, which was discovered in Antler Mine in southern Arizona, has not yet been illustrated. The 6 stamps to the right show that some countries simply illustrate minerals. Some don't even give them a name, like the Canada stamp in the top left, which is of copper. And a few misname them, but to spare their blushes, I've not included the stamp from Botswana, which does this. Others provide additional information. In the top right, there's the there's the 7-cent Southwest African stamp, shows the chemical formula for cuprite. And in the bottom right, the stamp from Peru shows a mineralogical diagram of chalcopyrite. So maybe I should only include stamps that are economically important in my collection and just wait on the United States Postal Service to issue an antlerite stamp. But then what about turquoise? It's a copper silicate, which has been a valuable semi-precious stone, but not an ore, since prehistory, known in Western Asia, Europe, and in the Americas. It usually appears on philatelic items illustrating jewelry, like this pane of stamps to the right, which I'll talk about in a moment. But there are some stamps that just illustrate the mineral specimens, such as the one from Cambodia. So should I just collect stamps with the mineral samples, like the one from Cambodia, or should I include jewelry stamps as well? Perhaps both, if there's a philatelic tale to tell, as is the case with the US 2-cent stamp, which was a make-up rate stamp produced to cover a number of increases in the US domestic postal rate in the 2000s. The design is part of a silver necklace with turquoise insets based on squash blossoms. It's a traditional Navajo design from the southwestern USA, where incidentally Tiffany's owned, or possibly still do own, turquoise mines. It was printed 4 times, and issued twice in 2006, though actually it was printed and released in 2005. So it was ready for a postal rate increase in January 2006. Now, if I zoom in to the bottom right into this area, you'll see the stamp in the bottom right-hand corner. So the years are printed on the bottom left of the stamp. You can see this is 2006, so printed possibly in 2005. But there were two issues with 2006. And to tell them apart, you have to do something else. You have to look here. And you'll see this little micro printing in the silver tendril. It says USPS, United States Postal Service. And this micro printing tells me that this 2006 2-cent Navajo jewelry stamp was from the Ashton Potter printing, rather than that which was printed by the American Packaging Corporation. So micro printing is something which is increasingly being found in stamps. And if you come along to the BTA weekend in 2022, I'll bring some of these stamps along and we can look at them under one of Owen Green's microscopes. I also analysed the 52 countries that have issued copper mineral stamps since 1960. In this graph to the left, countries which have issued more than 3 copper mineral stamps but do not have any copper mines are in white. They include some persistent bad eggs like Guinea-Bissau and Togo, both of which have issued more copper mineral stamps than any other countries. The top 10 copper producing countries in 2019 are in green if they've issued more than 3 stamps, and those that have only issued 1 or 2 are listed in the boxes below the graph. 8 of the top 10 countries that have issued stamps, Australia, Eight of the top 10 countries have issued stamps, but Australia and China haven't. None of these countries are prolific stamp issuers. Maybe they get so much of their revenue from copper exports that they don't actually need to target the pockets of stamp collectors like Guinea-Bissau and Togo and the Comoros. So a rule of thumb might be to only include mineral stamps if the mineral is or was mined in the country. That would mean excluding approximately 1/3 of 160 stamps. But what do I do about the mineral leuconite? It's a rare copper aluminium arsenate. It's only been illustrated on the 1998 375 franc Comoros stamp at the bottom of the slide. This is another country which has not yet dug deep enough to find any copper. A mineral's type locality is usually the location of its discovery. 12 of the 31 copper minerals on stamps, all of which were discovered in the 18th, 19th or 20th centuries, have type locations according to the International Mineralogical Database. Only Chile and Slovakia, which are identified in red on this table to the left, appear to have recognized this fact. Flipping the coin, Britain, which has failed to recognize this, despite having a very rich copper mineral heritage in Cornwall. Libethenite, the bottom of these 2 stamps, the lower of the 2 stamps on the slide, is a rare copper phosphate hydroxide discovered in near the town of Lubitova, which is now in Slovakia, in 1823. At that time, it was called Libethen, the German name, as it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the same year, euchroite, another copper arsenate, was discovered in the same area. That's the upper of the 2 stamps. So maybe you can do better than just to illustrate minerals. Maybe we can tell stories about their names, who discovered them, who they were named after, what they were named after, and link them to the history of mining. Libethen, for example, was part of the Protestant League of 7 mining towns. These towns are now in either Slovakia or northern Hungary. In Liberton, mining started well before 1379. That was the year that Liberton was made a royal town by Louis I of Hungary, who's illustrated here in this 14th century painting. And German miners were attracted to settle there. Germany was the center of mining in continental Europe at that time. It became a major mining center in medieval times, and a lucrative Hungarian trade developed across Europe. The Fuggers, a family from Augsburg in modern-day Germany, who had overtaken the Medicis as Europe's main bankers by that time, developed a monopoly of the European copper trade by the 15th century. The illustration to the right is of Jacob Fugger, also known as Jacob the Rich, and that's a story which can be developed quite nicely at some time in the future. Personalities can also add value and interest to mineral stamps. This is Ignacy Domeyko, and he appeared on a souvenir sheet of the famous mineralogists from the Central African Republic, a country which, despite being a prolific issuer of philatelic wallpaper, also has copper mines. He was a mineralogist who fled to Chile in the 1830s after partaking in the November uprising against the Russian Empire in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And as such, he's celebrated as famous son of Poland or Lithuania or Belarus. Anyway, leaving that behind, he became professor of mineralogy at the mining college of La Serena, north of Santiago, and later became rector of the University of Chile. While at La Serena, he was an active geologist, and he did a lot of exploration in the Atacama and the adjacent Andes. And while he was there, he discovered a number of minerals at Las Algodones silver mine, close to the city, one of which was Domeykite, which is illustrated on this stamp as part of the souvenir sheet. As I read about his life on the internet, I found the photograph that was used and reproduced on the souvenir sheet. I found it was housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And it's a mirror image, but it's exactly the same photograph as the one on the left. It was taken by Constanti, a Warsaw photographer, all right, and it was or is the property of the Société de Géographie en Paris. And that got me thinking about the mineral specimen, this here. And it didn't take long to find it was a specimen sold by John Betts, a New York fine mineral dealer. We corresponded. He knew nothing about the use of his copyrighted photograph, but he was pleased, and he said he'd let the buyer know. He told me Guinea-Bissau had approached him some years back about using some of his illustrations on their stamps. I just guessed that Central African Republic didn't get the memo about copyrights. Anyway, it actually gets better. The illustration here of Domeykite isn't. It's actually Mohawkite, which is a mixture of Domeykite, algodonite, and quartz. Algodonite is another copper arsenide that was first described in 1857 from the very same Las Algodones mine. Mohawkite, though, itself was named after the combination of minerals that was found in a mine in northern Michigan. So the company issuing these kind of stamps on behalf of many African clients over the last decade, remember that spike in stamps since 2010, is Stamperia in Lithuania. This sheet was one of theirs. Was it ever showed over the counter in Bangui and used postally? I doubt it. And that would mean that Stanley Gibbons wouldn't catalogue it. But given it's in the Francophone zone, we might consider there are better authorities than Stanley Gibbons. And Yves Intellier, do catalogue it, as do Scott. So let's include it in the collection. After all, there's a story to tell, or more than one story to tell. Now, the copper which is smelted from these minerals and the alloys which are made with other minerals have many important properties. And this has made copper one of our most useful metals. Some archaeologists, in fact, even call it the first metal, on the grounds it was probably the first metallic mineral ever found and put to use by humankind. My first exhibits were built around its properties and uses, and it still forms part of my collection. One of the last properties to be discovered, about 10 millennia after its discovery, i.e. in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was its ability to conduct electrical charge. So let's turn our attention to lightning, which was considered by influential clerics like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Martin Luther, whose father, by the way, was a copper miner in Saxony, was a punishment, an act of God, if you will. Ironically then, in medieval Europe, lightning was attracted to the tallest things that pointed skyward, i.e. the towers and spires of Gothic cathedrals. Following the church's teachings, people relied on prayer, burning incense, bringing out and parading holy relics, ringing consecrated bells during thunderstorms and the like to fend off lightning strikes. But many churches still caught fire. Strasbourg Cathedral was a particularly effective lightning rod. There were 4 lightning strike fires before 1015, when it burnt down completely. And the fires continued after it was rebuilt. Now remember the frantic bell ringing? Between 1750 and 1783 in Germany, 121 bell ringers perished ringing bells during storms. The first major blow against this religious dogma was Benjamin Franklin's famous electrical experiments with a kite, a key, and a rope in 1752. Later in the same year, he installed a copper lightning rod on the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral while working as a diplomat in London. And many people credit him as the inventor of the copper lightning conductor, but not the Czechs. In Bohemia, Canon Prokop Divis, like many clergymen, was interested in scientific things, in his case, atmospheric electricity. And he developed a device to attract lightning in the same year as Franklin's kite experiments. Fortuitously, he stabilized this device, which can be seen just behind his head on these stamps, but better in this replica. Fortuitously, he stabilized it to the ground with chains. So he grounded it or earthed it. But his parishioners were not impressed, and they pulled it down. So unthwarted, he built another one, this time on his church tower, and then the local monastery forced him to dismantle it. The canon's tribulations were typical of popular hostility to early lightning conductors, even after their worth was proven. St. Mark's in Venice, whose campanile had witnessed 8 lightning fires since 1388, only installed a lightning rod 14 years after their invention in 1776, and only then after another fire. In Brescia, in northern Italy, the town council stored its supply of gunpowder in the cathedral vaults. I don't need to tell you what happened there. But it wasn't just churches. Individuals started to install lightning conductors on their houses. The Swiss scientist and would-be mountaineer Horace Benedict de Saussure, illustrated on this maximum card to the left, erected a lightning rod on his Geneva house in 1771, but it caused his neighbours so much anxiety he feared they would riot. The maximum card, by the way, which has nothing to do with lightning, Shows his statue in the town of Chamonix with Mont Blanc in the background. And he failed to climb this mountain a number of times, and admitting defeat, he stumped up the cash for the first ascent. And the other person on the statue is Jacques Balmat, who made the first ascent on the 8th of August, 1786. He was accompanied by Michel Paccard, who, for reasons unknown to me, failed to make it onto the plinth. So here we have the perfect maximum card. We have Mont Blanc there, we have Mont Blanc there, we have the stamp there. It's the first day of issue. There's Césaire and Balmat, there's Césaire and Balmat. As we saw in a recent issue of Theme Scene, this is the perfect maximum card. Now, the maximum card to the right celebrates Robespierre. In Paris, a four-year-long lawsuit starting in 1780 ultimately gave Monsieur Saint-Omer the right to erect a lightning rod on his house, despite his neighbours' religious objections. That was one of the victories that established the fame of the young lawyer Robespierre, who, of course, like many lawyers, later entered politics, a kind of politics. Ultimately, science overcame religious dogma, and copper lightning conductors became integral to the construction of tall buildings. Businesses developed, as shown by this 1912 advertising cover, illustrated advertising cover from Des Moines for copper cable lightning rods, and this Publibel card from Belgium, 1919, advertising Legrette lightning conductors. But in case I've given you the mistaken impression that science triumphed entirely, the roof of the recently restored York Minster was set ablaze by a lightning strike in 1984. Apparently, the Dean of Strasbourg sent a telegram to the Archbishop of York saying, "Plus sachons." Now to the third part of my collection. The discovery of electricity led to a massive increase in the demand for copper around the world for wiring, machinery, scientific instrumentation. And this global phenomena, this increase in copper demand and the subsequent expansion of mining and smelting, was known as copper mania. And it linked mining expertise from the southwest of England, smelting expertise from South Wales and Central Europe, particularly Germany, to copper mines, newly discovered copper mines in Australia, New Zealand, Southern Africa, and the newly independent republics of South America in the early to mid-1980s, and then later in northern Michigan and the western USA. The colony of South Australia was founded in 1836, and it is a very proud colony in that it was the only colony in Australia which was not a convict colony. But that had its own problems, because almost a decade later, it was almost bankrupt. Then copper was discovered, and by the early 1850s, copper exports had saved the colony financially. It became home to the largest copper mine in the world, Burra Burra, at a settlement known by the Aboriginal name of Kuringa. And more on that later. Other smaller mines were prospected around the colony, often in remote locations like Nukulina in the South Australian outback. And this cover was sent to Nukulina, and we're going to look at that because it's a small, but actually very interesting part of the story of Coppermania. It's a gem to a thematic collector because not only is it philately very important, but it's also very important thematically. It is likely one of the first postal items to be delivered to Nukulina and returned from there. So it actually went through the town. Town I use in a very loose sense. It was a series of mine buildings. And was one of the first items through the post office at another mining town called Blinman, where the post office had been established by the South Australian government only 5 weeks before the letter arrived. So let's look at the route it took. This is one of 3 letters known that was sent from the insolvency court in Port Augusta on the 4th of October 1862. And it ties 2 Perkin-Bacon's 1-penny stamps with 2 circular date stamps of Port Augusta. It was sent to the Northern Mail Route. Along the Northern Mail Route, we can see Mr. John Pascoe, North Nucalina. And it was for an unpaid hotel bill to Mr. Pascoe, who at that time was believed to be working at Nucalina Mine. It travelled by postal rider from Port Augusta to Willocra, where it joined the Melrose to Angipina Northern Mail Route. That's the Northern Mail Route. Angipina was a gold mine which only had a post office from 1863 to 1866. So these towns in this part of the world are quite ephemeral. The letter was delivered to the recently opened post office at Blinman. And the postmaster tried to send it twice by probably somebody on a horse going up to Nucalina, about 35 kilometers away, and annotated the letter here and here to say it came back. He sent it back again, it came back. Fed up with that, he annotated it and put it in the mail to Adelaide on the 21st of November 1862. And as that mail travelled back down the Northern Mail Route, it was back stamped at Kanyaka with this circular date stamp on the 24th of November, 3 days later. This was probably the first place on the mail route that the letter came across where they had a date stamp delivered, because by that time, in November, late November 1862, Blinman hadn't received its cancelling device. Where the unclaimed was stamped, I don't know. Anthony Pressgrove, who's the font of all knowledge on South Australian postal history, says it was probably stamped at Blinman because they received these instructional stamps before they received the circular date stamps. It could, of course, also have been stamped at Kanyaka, or possibly when it reached the Adelaide General Post Office in their dead letter office, which was on the 26th of November, 5 days after leaving Blinman. And then it would have, so when it got to Melrose, it would have gone by mail through Coringa, where the Burra mine is, through another mining town called Kanyaka, and ended up in the Adelaide GPO. What though of this gentleman, John Pascoe? And this is where the thematic part of this cover comes in. He was the mine captain at Nucalina from 1860 onwards, about 1860. But he wasn't there by April 1863, according to newspaper articles. And maybe he wasn't even there in late 1862 because the mail was undelivered. Now, I've looked up immigrant ship records and the US and the UK census records, and I think my best estimate is that he was a 20-year-old miner from Brig in Cornwall. That's about 12 kilometers east of Penzance, just to the very north of the Lizard Peninsula. And he was 20 years old when he and his wife Anne embarked on a bark called the Gilmore on the 10th of March 1857 at Plymouth. I have a picture of a bark here. Unfortunately, it's not of the Gilmore, but it would have been a very similar ship that took them to Port Adelaide. It took 123 days to reach Port Adelaide. And the ship had an eventful voyage. Off Ascension Island, it was followed and circled by another bark, which was rather sinisterly painted in black with black sails. It came very close at some times of the day, and it looked to see what the bark was carrying. And I think the assumption is when they realized it was carrying about 150 immigrants, many of whom were probably impoverished, it set sail for somewhere else, only after raising the Peruvian flag. But I think that was a ruse. I don't think it was anything to do with Peru at all. The captain reported when he reached Port Adelaide that he suspected they were pirates. Anyway, John landed in July 1857, and he worked for another mining company near Adelaide before moving to Nuku'ulina. So a mine captain is somebody who's an experienced miner. He's like a foreman of the mine. John had been mining for a number of years before he emigrated to Australia. So he'd probably got a good 10 years experience before he went to Nuku'ulina. So the link to Cornwall is the critical link here. The Cornish connection is very important to the story of copper mania. Cornish mines were in severe decline by the early 1800s. Unemployment rates were running very high, and hundreds of experienced miners like John were emigrating to mines around the world. Their expertise had such value in hard rock mining. But Cornwall also exported technology, specifically the steam pump to drain deep water from deep mines. This had been developed and manufactured at Hale on the North Cornwall coast. And those distinctive engine houses, which we see illustrated on this UK booklet from the 1980 Industrial Archaeology series, and on at least a couple of UK stamps, such as this here. These distinctive engine houses and boiler room chimneys are conspicuous artifacts of the post-mining landscape. There are over 600 in Devon and Cornwall. But outside the Southwest Peninsula, the greatest number are in South Australia, including this one at Nuku'ulina. There's also illustrated on this special cancellation from Moonta, another mining area in South Australia. And there's the Hughes pump house, and there's the picture which I took when I visited. So this is a clear indication of the Cornish link, both in terms of people and in terms of mining technology. But there's something else here. This is a very artificial cover. And it's got a couple of pictorial hand stamps, one from the Copper Triangle, and it celebrates the Cornish Festival, which is held every 2 years in Kadina, another one of the mining towns in South Australia. So Cornish culture went with the miners, and it went with the mining technology to South Australia, to other parts of Australia, to New Zealand, to northern Michigan, to Chile, to South Africa, in fact, all over the world. So it is important to try and link parts of a story together. And here, working through these, we see that the discovery of electrical conductivity in the 18th century led to an exponential growth in the demand for copper in the early 19th century, and that exponential growth has continued ever since. But anyway, in the 19th century, copper mania was the order of the day. Copper exploration, production, and trade going hand in hand. And that led to advances in mining and the immigration of Cornish miners, Cornish engineers, but also Welsh smelters, German smelters, and so on. It also led to the expansion of scientific interest in mineralogy. And as we can see from Ignacy Domeyko, at this time, he moved to Chile, became a mining geologist, and discovered new copper minerals. So the whole thing can be linked, which is what the Americans call the golden thread in their thematic story. So I just want to finish with returning to Coringa and the Burra Burra mine, which, if you remember, saved the South Australian colony. And I'm going to leave you with a taster of my favourite page, which is now featuring in Theme Scene. The town of Coringa sprung up in the late 1840s to serve the Burra Burra mine and other adjacent prospects. This is an illustration from the Illustrated London News, almost 172 years ago to the day I'm giving this talk. An adjacent prospect was Bon Accord mine in the township of Aberdeen. Not a surprising coincidence to any Aberdonian, as Bon Accord has been used in the city since the 14th century wars of Scottish independence. The entire in the bottom left is a report from the owners of the prospect in Aberdeen that it was economically unviable. In fact, Bon Accord mine never found copper. But Aberdeen didn't have a post office when this letter was written in 1851. So it was posted in Coringa, only a few miles away, and includes a rare use of the Crown paid hand stamp. So after visiting and walking over these mines in 2019, I was sitting in my car contemplating what might have been at Aberdeen when I realised that I was sitting right outside the old Aberdeen post office, complete with its fluted Victorian pillar box, which I've included for the edification of pillar box aficionados. So Aberdeen got its post office, but alas, not its mine. So here's a request. Why not send Wendy Buckle your favourite item or page for the new feature in Theme Scene? And while I have your attention, seriously consider sending a page to BTA's inaugural one-page competition. Closing date, January the 31st, 2021. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will